Okay, coming into the Australian Grand Prix, the general consensus was that Mercedes and Ferrari were the benchmark in terms of one lap pace and also in terms of the ability to generate a lot of power, especially with the ICE. We all suspected that Mercedes would be very powerful with the ICE and Ferrari would be also. But I think there was the feeling that Mercedes would have the electrical side of the power unit a lot better. And what we saw today was that it wasn't even close in terms of one lap pace. And even if Ferrari has as much power derived from its ICE as Mercedes, it's clear that the electrical side, and especially with the software and with the ability to sustain power for a whole lap, is superior to Ferrari. We saw George Russell beat Leclerc by 9 tenths of a second, and Leclerc coming in P4. Later on, we'll talk about why he's even struggling with respect to other people. But what we want to see right here is how in the world is Mercedes a second faster than Ferrari, then almost 6 tenths of a second faster than their closest competitor, which was Haja, which is a big gap, but I think that's not so bad. But what we want to do is look at how they were so successful in blowing out the field in the qualifying. I know we all knew that Russell, especially, was probably sandbagging during free practices and during the tests in Bahrain, but we thought that, or at least over a lap, it would be very close. Now, I thought that over a lap, Ferrari had the advantage over Mercedes based on their performances in Bahrain, but a slight advantage. Also, with the caveat that it's only an advantage if Mercedes is not putting on its full engine mode. And I think they weren't putting on their full engine mode. So the idea was that if they're not, Ferrari has an advantage. And even if they would go to their full engine mode, Ferrari would be slightly better or even with them over a lap when it comes to raw power, because we know that the Ferrari car has a good turbo to weight ratio and is punchy and seems to do well, but probably after a couple of laps relative to Red Bull and McLaren and Mercedes, tire deg would probably start to kick in for them. But I had no idea that over a lap it would almost be a second. And the only way this can be explained is that even if so, let's just assume that Ferrari and Mercedes are equal when it comes to raw power. And even raw power, I mean, what I mean by raw power is the available raw power that they're able to deploy. Let's say that they're equal in deployment. Then they're definitely not equal in sustained deployment, which would mean that when they both put in that burst and they have a lot of power available from especially mostly from the ICE and then in part from the electrical part of the battery, even though they may have the same amount of power, for whatever reason, Mercedes is able to sustain it over a lap, not over a race, because over a lap is going to even be worse. Over one lap, this is be able to sustain it a lot better and also be able to measure it out, because we know that with the way the regs work this year, you have to be able to harvest energy, especially for the straights. So through whatever mechanism, Mercedes is far superior. I think part of the reason it's superior is that they probably have better software and GPS, which lays out the lap and also lays out the race than Ferrari. And I think other factors come into play in which they probably integrated their engine better with their body, so they have better aerodynamics. And when you have better aerodynamics, the momentum from your speed and from the aerodynamics also helps in charging the battery. And we also know that Ferrari changed their front suspension this year to make it more aggressive, which leads to tire deg. And tire deg also, funny enough, even over a lap can make a difference. So let's take a look at Russell's approach. What we saw if you look at Russell versus Leclerc, the Ferrari and Leclerc in general were slightly faster through the corners, but by the time they got off the corners, they had far less pace than the Mercedes and far less straight line speed. We saw that George Russell was 10 kilometers per hour faster on the straights than Leclerc, and Leclerc was marginally faster on the corners. And I think this all has to do with the harvesting that Mercedes had compared to what Ferrari has, because Ferrari was taking a brute approach. They didn't really have a strategy on harvesting energy. Leclerc and Hamilton were coming into the corners at a higher speed, and they were harvesting less energy coming into the corners. So what we saw that what Russell was doing is when he's approaching the first corner, corner one, he would start super clicking earlier, in which when even though he's pressing the accelerator all out, the car is harvesting energy and is slowing down or it's flatlining and isn't picking up speed once he gets to about 300 kilometers per hour. Now, at this point, what it's doing is it's generating or it's charging the battery for that boost once it gets midway through the corners. Then at a certain point, he lifts about 70 meters before the corner. And then just before hitting the corner, he presses his brakes. And pressing the brake is part of the way he drives. You know where your braking zone is to have a smooth transition into the corner, especially Russell. But at the same time, the braking charges the car also. So with these three phases, with the phase with the super revving, where the software is turning his flat out so-called acceleration, but it's not acceleration because the software is not translating that energy into acceleration. It's charging the batteries. And then with the second part where he's lifting, and then when he lifts, the actual speed of the car and the aerodynamics is also charging the battery. And then when he presses the brakes again, it's charging the battery. That combined with the way that the software works and the hardware of the Mercedes car works gives him so much energy coming into corner one that from 1 to 6, once he gets off the corner, he has far more speed than anybody else. And that's because what that whole situation did was convert the kinetic energy, which comes from the power of the power unit, especially the ICE, into what the speed that's carrying him from 1 to 2, and then I think it's to 3 to 4. Then when he's coming into corner 6, he does the same thing again, the same process of charging, and then the momentum carries him through the lap. So what you're looking at with the Mercedes car is that it has a tremendous amount of available energy. Then it has a sophisticated interplay between the software and the algorithm and the hardware, which translates that power into kinetic energy, which is why you see Russell beating Leclerc by 9 tenths of a second and beating Haja by 6 tenths of a second. So if he's beating Haja by 6 tenths of a second, and Verstappen didn't make it to Q3, we can bet that he would have been beating Verstappen by 3 tenths of a second, which is a lot, but not too much. And it makes sense because the Ford engine that Verstappen is driving also has a fantastic electrical component to the engine and also has a fantastic algorithm. Audi has a fantastic algorithm, but doesn't have enough power. So if you're seeing Russell beat Verstappen by 3 tenths, what I'm doing is I'm extrapolating because I think Verstappen would have beaten Haja by 3 tenths of a second, and Haja was 6 tenths of a second behind Russell. So if Russell is 3 tenths of a second ahead of Verstappen, I think the difference is that the Mercedes car has a lot more available power and a lot, not necessarily that it measures that power over more efficiently than Red Bull. It's not more efficient, but it has more raw power available. And that would make sense in that in general, the Mercedes engine is considered the most powerful in being able to bring out the most raw power. And also it has the compression. And when you add that compression, I think that compression is what would bring that 3 tenths of a second advantage over the Red Bull. But I'm not sure if Red Bull is using that compression loophole because they knew about it also. But let's get back to Ferrari. So why is Ferrari so far behind? It's so far behind most likely because it doesn't have a sophisticated software which is able to give it the right strategy to to harvest energy as efficiently as Mercedes and even Red Bull, which was ahead of them. Haja was ahead of Leclerc and what's his name? Hamilton. I'm beginning to forget his name. He's old and irrelevant. They have so the fact that those guys are ahead shows that even though Ferrari may have a more powerful engine than Red Bull, they don't have the algorithm that knows how to measure the energy, and they just don't have a what I would call speed endurance, the ability to deploy powerfully over and over and over and over again for laps. And I think that's partly because they didn't focus on their software, also partly because their engine is not integrated the right way with the car, so that they may need to look at their aerodynamics, and also the fact that they changed their front suspension to a more aggressive setup, and they seem to be built for torque coming off of corners, coming into corners. And then the third thing I would say is that they're very unstable in corners. They have a lot of downforce, but on the corners, they're not stable. And even though they enter the corners at a higher speed and they get through the corners at a higher speed, they're losing more and more time on the corners through stability. So that by the time they get off the corner, even if they were faster than Red Bull and Mercedes, when they're coming off the corner, they have a lower exit speed from the corner because they lose so much time due to instability. So that would explain why Mercedes, even though Ferrari might be equal to them on raw power, is beating them overall over a lap by 9/10 of a second. Once again, it's because of the software is allowing the car to continuously deploy high levels of power from the ICE and from the electrical side of the battery, which is not just a function of the software, but it's a function of the whole way the engine is integrated with the body. So overall, they created a more sophisticated energy that's able to derive more power longer, even though Ferrari might be able to derive a lot of power for short bursts. And when you compare Mercedes to Red Bull might be just as sophisticated with their Ford engine, but they don't have as much raw power available. And part of that is because of their ratio compression advantage, and also just because Mercedes is second to none when it comes to power unit development. Okay, so now let's look at McLaren. So we know that McLaren is a stable car. They have a Mercedes engine, but they were far behind Red Bull. They even far behind Piastri, I think Piastri finished about 8/10 of a second behind George Russell. He was even behind Haja. And what I'm going to suppose is that McLaren is still a fantastic car when it comes to balance. It has the best balance. It's stable during the corners and everything, but it just doesn't have as much available power that Mercedes has, and even that Red Bull has. And I would say that the reason that is because even though they have the Mercedes engine, they don't have the whole power unit as it's set up with the gearbox and everything else, and then just not integrating it as well as Mercedes is. But that's not McLaren's philosophy. Is not about power or aerodynamics. It's about mechanical grip. It's about stability and everything else. So over a lap, they're never going to be that great. This is in the ground effect era where they had such an advantage because the cars had to be so low to the ground, and a lot of cars just couldn't handle the instability of that, and their stability helped them. So what we'll see in the long race is that McLaren will be right up there with Red Bull and Mercedes when it comes to tire deg and everything else, but they just don't have they probably don't have the sophisticated software and that integration of power that can bring a lot of power, the most power out of the engine and sustain it, because that's not their focus. Their focus is always on stability and having a wide window. Actually, right now, I think Mercedes and Red Bull have the widest window, but Mercedes' main advantage right now is the compression ratio trick. Now let's look at why is it the case that even McLaren with Piastri is beating Ferrari over one lap. And this goes to the fact that even though Ferrari has a power advantage over McLaren and may even be able to deploy as much energy over a long period of time as McLaren, the Ferrari car is very, very unstable in the corners. They tried to address this by putting a exhaust winglet. That didn't work because it made problems of a jarring effect coming into the corners. But in general, what it shows is that Ferrari has a lot of work to do. Punchy car with a lot of explosion, and that's it. They need to address their instability coming into the corners, which I think is a function of the fact that Leclerc likes a loose rear end, and a pointy car. So they're just going to be unstable. And I think that's a big deal for them. And they're going to be, from what we're looking at now, Ferrari and McLaren are going to be fighting for third or fourth as the best car, and Red Bull and Mercedes are going to be fighting for first and second. Um, Now let's look at Red Bull, because Red Bull has the opposite approach of qualifying and about harvesting energy than Mercedes. We see that with Russell, who's a smooth operator. He begins his harvesting approach when he's on the straight earlier, thereby sacrificing some straight line speed, probably about 150 meters coming into corner one, or 150 meters coming into corner three, which is the other zone. He starts the process of not pushing for speed, but pushing for harvesting to give that boost coming on the other corner. And so what you're seeing, what he's doing, while he's doing this, he already has momentum. So what he does is, once again, the software starts to go into overdrive, in which when he's flooring the gas, when he's flooring the accelerator, it's not accelerating or building up speed. It's taking that energy and charging the battery. Then he lifts about 70 or 80 meters from the corner, and then coming into the corner, he brakes hard, but in a nuanced way, so he doesn't lose stability and has a smooth entry into the corner to charge the battery again. And then what you'll see is that coming off the corner, fantastic pace, hits a high straight line speed, probably not as high as Red Bull, but will get so much more time through the corner than Red Bull. And I'm going to explain why. So now let's look at Verstappen's approach. Verstappen's approach is the approach I like because it's old school. He's manually determining everything, whereas Russell and some of the other drivers are letting the software take at least 60 to 70, 50 to 60 to 70% of the process. He takes it into his own hand. He goes all out on the straights and doesn't use that process of slowing down or trying to harvest energy, which is going to hurt him later on unless this is what happens. He doesn't harvest energy throughout the straights, but at the last part, just before he enters the corner, especially corner one, what he'll do is an aggressive downshifting and aggressive braking, which provides so much revving and so much energy that it charges the battery and gives him momentum coming off the corners. Now, the advantage of this is that going on the straights, he's faster on the straights than everybody else because he doesn't harvest early. But the problem is that he harvests late. And to try to make up for the fact that he wasn't harvesting earlier, he has to downshift aggressively and go hard on his brakes, which may make up for that fact and give him straight line speed. But the problem is that it gives him too much instability in the corners in a car that already has problems because it's pointy and slides too much. So that it means that he's going to pay the price with instability on the corners. I know what his strategy is. His strategy is that if he can do this radical approach and qualify first, then during a race, he can be less radical with it and be in the front and let everybody else suffer from dirty air and try to catch him with his tire management. But we see that it's a very dangerous game he's playing, because to charge so much energy in such a small amount of time entering the corner by downshifting, because when you downshift, it increases the revs, and also hitting the brakes, that revs the engine. It creates instability, which negates whatever supercharge you had that allows you to keep your momentum from not slowing down on the corners to super rev or to charge the battery. Now we get into a crazy period of F1 where we have to talk about this crazy shit. But in general, Verstappen is trying to have the best of both worlds. He's trying to have as much speed on the straight, because during a race, he knows that if he's going all out on the straights, you can't pass him, and it's more difficult to pass on the corners. And then he's trying to charge himself again for the straights again at the latest moment so that he's staying ahead on the straight by having a radical downshift. But the problem, once again, is that it leads to instability. And this is part of the problem that Ferrari is suffering too. They're doing something similar to what Verstappen is doing. They're trying to maximize the straights and not harvest. And then they're trying to have an abrupt harvesting at the corners, which leads to instability. If I were Verstappen, I'd keep doing that, because if they can figure out a setup to handle that tremendous pressure, then it would help. But we saw that it backfired in qualifying, which is why part of the reason why he had such a massive lockout and crash is several things. First of all, the torque and everything of that car was just too much for the rear, and the looseness of his rear actually led to a chain reaction, which led to the locking out based on the forces of torque and everything. But I also have a feeling that it was also because he was downshifting coming into corner one, or coming into the corner. I think it was corner one where he had his issue, where he was about to start his flying lap. And there's an inherent instability in the car because it's pointy and it backfired. But I would keep on going with that gamble if I were Verstappen, and have the team to push the car to become more stable and find out ways, and also to have a less aggressive approach into the corners. So we'll end with this. So clearly, when you look at all of the variables I've talked about, Mercedes has the best overall balance. They've got a lot of raw power available. They're able to sustain it longer than teams who may have the same amount available because of their software. And they've got I call him the professor. They've got a very good strategy in which they enter into corners, especially corner one, where you need to charge for going up to corner six. They enter into the corners with a gradual, slightly slower approach with harvesting, and also then enter in the corner where Russell brings his aggressive braking, which is not as aggressive as Verstappen's downshifting and everything else, to charge again and to carry them through the corner. So they've addressed everything. They've addressed stability, they've addressed raw power, and they've also addressed over a lap, being able to sustain a lot of that raw power over a whole lap. Verstappen the software that he has can sustain a lot of raw power over a lap, but the problem is his strategy of downshifting at the corners is dangerous. And also, even though they're able to sustain a lot of raw power, he doesn't have as much raw power available to him that teams like Ferrari does. And even though Ferrari has a lot of raw power, they don't have a strategy. And apparently they don't have, they have a strategy similar to Verstappen's, which is dangerous. But unlike Verstappen, they don't have a software which can show them how to measure their power over a track. And in general, Ferrari has a lot of problems. All they have basically is a car that has a pretty good available raw power. And a lot of the reason they have that power is not because of the engine, is because their turbo is smaller than a lot of teams. So that because they have that ratio is lower, they have that punch. But the fact that they have a smaller turbo is a problem for them in terms of absolute raw power. So we're entering a brave new world of F1. We're not going to talk about how the race is going to unfold, but I think the way it's going to unfold is Antonelli and Russell are going to come first and second in this race. If Verstappen had qualified in third rather than Haja, Verstappen might have been able to come P2, maybe even P1, but it's going to be P1 to the Mercedes guys, and I'm going to say that Leclerc is going to pass Haja. I don't know why I'm saying that, because Haja has a better car, but Leclerc is a more experienced driver. So tell us what you think. Like, share, and subscribe to Formula One Fanatics, the most fanatical Formula One show on earth. Danke.